Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics.
Today's episode will be focused on recent antitrust efforts in the United States. And before we start talking about this, I know that this was your suggestion, Ben. So, how do we even manage to pick this topic?
Huh. Well, I recently watched a video of the comedian Hassan Minaj interviewing Lena Khan, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and it was very funny. And ever since then, I really couldn't get the topic of antitrust off my mind. So that's one reason. But I guess the real reason is that we have seen major changes in antitrust policy over the past 4 years. And I worked in economic consulting for a year and a half. And while doing that, we were very often retained on behalf of parties in major antitrust related court cases. And so I was able to see a lot of these battles being fought in the legal system as kind of a foot soldier, and I've had an interest in antitrust policy ever since, and I think it's important that we unpack these policies.
That's interesting. I love Hassan Minaj, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot about the topic here. So, kudos to you for sticking to it. So, for our audience, as with the prior episode, we're going to try to keep this as interesting as possible. We'll focus on a few main points here. First will be what monopolies are from an economic theory perspective, and then look at the prevalence of monopolies in the US, and finally summarize some of the recent efforts to stop corporate consolidation and discuss whether they've been successful. So, with that, Ben, do you want to start us off by explaining what monopolies are in the first place?
Yeah, I can do that. Monopoly is a market structure with a single seller or producer that assumes a dominant position in a given industry or sector. Monopolies are characterized by really just one company supplying a good or service, a lack of competition within the market, and to that end, no real similar substitutes for the product being sold. Monopolies are generally discouraged in free market economies because they, as I already mentioned, limit consumer substitutes and thus limit consumer choice by dictating price changes and creating barriers for competitors to enter the marketplace. Conceptually, there are two main ways for a monopoly to come into existence. That is through vertical or horizontal integration. Vertical integration occurs when a company takes control of its entire supply chain. And the goal here is to increase that company's power in the marketplace, to streamline its operations, and ultimately that can allow it to lower costs each step of the supply chain. Horizontal integration, on the other hand, involves buying competing companies in the market and becoming the sole producer through that channel. And this method of growth allows companies to gain market share and market power, to eliminate their competition, to acquire new products and services, a larger customer base, and ultimately to increase profits as a result of that.
That's a helpful overview, Ben. And maybe while we're on this topic, I'm sure that there are two sides to the debate on whether monopolies are a net positive or a net negative. So, do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, there are some pros and cons to these economic structures. On the one hand, monopolies typically reap the benefits of economies of scale, which is the ability to produce mass quantities at lower costs per unit, which can lead to lower prices for consumers. And if a company has a large degree of either vertical or horizontal integration, really they theoretically will have a greater ability to mass produce items at a lower cost. Another argument on behalf of monopolies is that they can, in some cases, lead to a faster pace of development. Without a large amount of competition, there can be greater incentives for companies to take more risk and invest in innovation without really, fear of competition necessarily undercutting some of their short-term economic capabilities. A final reason that many tolerate the existence of monopolies is a concept called natural monopolies, which refers to this idea that you can have markets that in some cases are small enough that really only one firm realistically can operate within the market. And as a result of that, I think there have been many cases in antitrust over the past century where corporations have more or less made the argument that they're a monopoly because the market structure, in essence, sort of dictates that there can only be one firm, that is the company in question. However, I don't really buy all of these arguments at a broader scale with respect to antitrust policy. The main case against monopolies is that they can use their power and privilege to distort the market from its equilibrium. Many monopolies have a tendency to use their advantages in market power to create artificial scarcities, to fix prices, and in some cases to get away with producing lower quality products to consumers without the repercussions of losing market share. Additionally, there may also be less of an incentive to uphold strong ESG standards and ethics when consumers may not really have a choice between products if there's really only one product from one producer being sold in a monopoly situation.
Yeah, that's all interesting. And in fact, I've read that some economists say that concentration of market power is largely to blame for decades of flat wages and weak productivity growth that we talk about quite often. Um, and many of these same economists say that competition is a so-called economic lubricant in many ways. Companies normally will grow their profits by delivering better products at lower prices than their competitors. And this is a pretty dynamic process in which competitors constantly enter and drop out of the market. And, it's called creative destruction. Um, it's probably worth mentioning to our audience as well that there are ways to actually measure market concentration quantitatively. There's an index called the Hirschman-Herfindahl Index, and it's one common measure of market concentration, which measures the size of companies relative to the size of the industry that they're in. And it's calculated by squaring the market share of each firm competing in a market and then summing the resulting numbers. And so the index can range from close to zero to as high as 10,000. And a lower value here indicates a less concentrated market.
I see. That's a helpful overview, Sachin. Now, regarding some of the cons surrounding monopolies that I mentioned earlier, there are antitrust laws and regulations that were put into place as a response to monopolies in the past to protect consumers and to ensure an open market that has the kind of creative destruction that you mentioned, Sachin. And so, two really important laws that our listeners should be aware of here are first, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1890 to limit trusts, precursor to monopolies, which are groups of companies that conspired to fix prices. And this act helped to dismantle de facto monopolies, including the Standard Oil Company and the American Tobacco Company. Next, there's also the Clayton Act, which was passed by Congress in 1914, and that created rules for mergers and corporate transactions. And it also enumerated practices that could violate the Sherman Antitrust Act. Next, there are two organizations in the United States that are really primarily tasked with enforcing these antitrust regulations. First, there is the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC for short, whose mandate is to protect the public from unfair anti-competitive business practices. Next, there's also the Department of Justice, or DOJ for short, which operates an antitrust division whose mandate is to promote economic competition. And both of these organizations can take parties to court if they believe that they have violated existing antitrust regulations, which, as we will discuss later, has been a source of a fair amount of litigation over the past 4 years.
I think now would be a good time to move the conversation towards the prevalence of monopolies in the US. And, while pure monopolies where a single company dominates an entire market are fairly rare in the US, monopoly-like behavior and significant market concentration are certainly prevalent in several industries. And in fact, the US ecosystem has become more concentrated over the years, and I'll share a few stats here to underscore this. There are three companies that control about 80% of mobile telecoms and 95% of credit cards. Four companies have 70% of airline flights within the US. And similarly, just four companies control 85% of US corn seed sales which is up from 60% in 2000, and 75% of soybean seed sales. And that's a jump from about 50%. The tech industry as well has gotten a ton of focus in the past few years. For example, the DOJ has argued that Google has a monopoly on search engines and text ads because the company has access to more query data, which allows it to better target searches and ads to its customers. And the more queries a search engine receives, the more it learns about what makes a good answer, and that makes it better. And Google's rivals don't have the same access to distribution channels, and they have a harder time, therefore, to improve their products. And I think that the impact of this can be seen on a more macro level as well. That is the increased concentration more broadly. You'll find that wealth and power is increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer cities, meaning that as larger cities like San Francisco, New York, and Washington thrive, there's a growing number of smaller communities that increasingly find themselves struggling. In fact, 70% of the world's ultra high net worth individuals reside in just 10 cities globally, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Huh. Yeah, that's an impressive concentration. But right now, what I think is extremely interesting and where I want to focus this next section of the podcast is that for much of the past 50 years, in spite of some of the robust regulatory frameworks that we have in place to deal with monopolies, the US really has not been intervening in corporate transactions to a significant extent to prevent corporations from accumulating the kind of market power that you just described, Sachin. And I think much of that can be traced back to the legal scholar Robert Bork, who argued that the intent of antitrust laws was to protect consumer well-being and instead was not to protect competition for the sake of competition. And because, as we've already discussed, mergers and monopolies in some cases can allow businesses to lower costs and improve services, Bork's philosophy, which has been widely adopted, had the effect of encouraging the government to limit its intervention in areas related to antitrust and competition. And really, Bork's philosophy is proven to be very influential. It was the standard of federal antitrust regulation for 40 years, in administrations, both Democratic and Republican, all the way through the Trump administration. However, all of that importantly changed when the Biden administration came to power in early 2021. As we have discussed for years, there has been a consensus building that large corporations were controlling a dominant share of important industries, in that consumers and societal well-being could be harmed as a result of that.
Yeah, and all that led to the Biden administration taking a few important steps towards greater enforcement of antitrust laws. First, President Biden signed an executive order in June 2021 that provided detailed guidance for federal agencies to combat corporate consolidation in a variety of industries. And second, the administration appointed a variety of officials with fairly hawkish antitrust views to key positions in the government. That included naming Lena Khan, who's a Yale Law School graduate, um, as chair of the FTC, Jonathan Cantor as head of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, and placing Tim Wu on the National Economic Council.
The end result of that has been a significant increase in pushback by the federal government against large-scale mergers, primarily via the DOJ and the FTC suing parties in large transactions in which one party might gain some dominant level of market share. The FTC and the DOJ together filed 50 merger enforcement actions in the year 2022, representing the highest level of enforcement activity by these organizations in over 20 years. And there have been a number of important cases that the FTC and the DOJ have pushed forth in this time frame. For example, there has been an ongoing antitrust trial against Google regarding its advertising practices. And likewise, these agencies have, just as one example among many, contested the proposed merger of the grocery stores Kroger and Albertsons.
So, Ben, what do you think the effect of this increased enforcement has been?
It's hard to say, but I think that there are a few key points to consider when looking at these antitrust actions so far. And just a preview here, I think it is fair to say that the record of antitrust policy over the past several years has been mixed with, some compelling points really being made on both sides. The first thing that I'd think about is whether these actions by the DOJ and the FTC have been needed. Sachin, as you noted, there are some instances in which it really does seem that a small number of corporations have some level of monopoly control over the economy, and that, of course, risks harm to consumers. In August of 2024, for example, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia Judge Amit Mehta ruled that Google had illegally maintained a monopoly over its online search service, which is something that you were discussing earlier. And remedies for that are being contemplated now, and that really strikes me as actually a productive effort to grapple with, some aspects of monopoly control over our economy. But there may be some counterexamples to that. For instance, the FTC filed a suit against the pharmaceutical giant Amgen for its acquisition of Horizon Therapeutics, despite these companies having no overlapping products. So that raises the question of whether that action by the FTC could be some form of overreach. Second, I think it's important to consider whether these enforcement actions have actually been effective. Over the past 2.5 years, roughly, since appointing some of these more strict enforcers, the FTC has interestingly lost every single merger challenge it has brought through litigation across both federal and administrative courts. It really has not seen any significant wins in lost cases such as Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, Meta's acquisition of Within, and Illumina's acquisition of Grail, just to name a few examples. Now, granted, staff at the FTC might retort that seeing litigation through is not the only option for effective enforcement. There are apparently at least 19 deals that were simply abandoned as a result of the FTC bringing forth charges. In other words, the companies involved in these deals decided that dealing with the litigation wasn't worth it and decided to not pursue the deal as a result. Still, however, some of these high-profile court cases and the losses that the U.S. government has suffered may indicate that perhaps they've been overly zealous in their interpretation of their authorities. Finally, the last question that I think is worth asking is whether the costs of these actions outweigh their benefits. For example, the FTC intervention in the proposed merger of the airlines JetBlue and Spirit has delayed the merger by years and reportedly really significantly strained Spirit's finances. And similarly, the proposed merger of Kroger and Albertsons that I mentioned earlier has been delayed by the FTC, and that has been quite costly for these companies. And there are also some other effects beyond, the immediate effects of parties being subject to review during mergers. For example, there's a real risk that fear over potential actions by the FTC or the DOJ could make companies less likely to undertake deals in the future. But with all that said, there may also be some benefits to breaking up monopoly control over the economy or preventing further corporate consolidation, as we've already discussed. And so, once again, I think that there are some compelling points on both sides. And when we look back on this period in 20 years, I wonder if we'll consider it to have been an effective use of the US government's time, or perhaps something that's more noble, but maybe misguided.
Yeah, it's a pretty complicated issue, and I think you've outlined it well there, Ben. I tend to agree with your overview here, and I think that there are a lot of reasons that this area in particular merits more scrutiny. But you're right that the costs of enforcement can be high, and not all of these actions might be as productive as they may seem. So ultimately, we'll have to wait longer term to see whether they have been justified.
Yeah, I think so. And so, on that note, join us for our episode next week. There have been, as you're all probably aware, an unfortunate number of hurricanes in the past month, which has got Sachin and I thinking about how they are affecting markets. And so, we'll take that episode to explore how the rising prevalence of natural disasters is affecting insurance premiums. Should be very interesting. And so, we look forward to you joining us then.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views in this podcast are our own and are not reflective of any institutions that we're associated with. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share with a friend or family member. We'll see you again next time.